Who are these Samaritans anyway? Seen so negatively in Matthew and so positively in Luke and John. And how can a Bible reader like yourself understand these two very different views, Matthew's view and Luke and John's view, of Jesus' attitude toward and interaction with them? Knowledge of the Samaritans of ancient times is very sketchy, often contradictory, and in many instances simply non-existent. But we're going to try our best. Contemporary Samaritans, there are about 500 of them near Nablus, claim that they have directly descended from the northern Israelite tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh, from the northern kingdom's times, 922 to 722 BCE. See that blue area on the right, on the left side? Kingdom of Israel. See Shechem, Samaria there, right? The Deuteronomic historian, in contrast, differs with the Samaritans, the modern Samaritans' own appraisal of their own pedigree. He relates that the Samaritans descended from colonists who had been relocated in regions of Samaria from the lands that the Assyrian Empire had conquered: Babylon, Kuta, Ava, Hamath, and Sepharvaim. That sounds like 5, right? Second Kings 17:24 from the Deuteronomic history, presented there in green. The king of Assyria brought people from Babylon, Kutha, Ava, Hamath, and Sepharvaim, and settled them in the cities of Samaria in place of the Israelites. They took possession of Samaria and dwelt in its cities. Samaritans are becoming half-breeds in the mind of the Deuteronomic historian. When God sent lions to attack these aliens, Assyria repatriated an Israelite priest who settled in Bethel and instructed the colonists how to live properly in the fear of Yahweh. 2 Kings 17, verse 25 to 28. When they first settled there, they did not venerate Yahweh. So Yahweh sent lions among them that killed some of them. A report reached the king of Assyria. The nations you deported and settled in the cities of Samaria do not know the proper worship of the God of the land. Notice how polytheistic and henotheistic this is. How the gods are national gods. Yahweh's a national God bound to a certain geography. Okay? So he has sent lions among them that are killing them, since they do not know the law of the God of the land. The king of Assyria gave the order: send back some of the priests you deported to go there and settle, to teach them the proper worship of the God of the land. How interesting, huh? So one of the priests who had been deported from Samaria returned and settled in Bethel and began to teach them how to venerate Yahweh. This view of the Samaritans, different from their own self-appraisal, is also reflected in the historian Josephus, writing in the late 1st century in his Antiquities. The Samaritan self-identification insists that the majority of them have always been, and still are, loyal to Israel's God and to Israelite tradition. A small group of them exists to this day near Nablus. However, the identification given by the Bible and Josephus places Samaritan faith and loyalty to God in doubt. Indeed, the biblical record describes these colonists as loose henotheists, worshippers of Yahweh true, but also of other gods brought with them to Samaria from their lands of origin or former residence. Henotheists that are really disguised polytheists.
Would you explain those two words for a pilot?
Yeah.
Henotheist means, all right, so you all know what monotheism means. Monotheism, worship of one God.
Okay.
All right. Henotheism polytheism means worship of many gods. Polytheism, worship of many gods. Monotheism, worship of one God. Henotheism means worship of one God, but you acknowledge there are other gods. In the Bible, brother, you mostly get henotheism on the way to monotheism. On the way to monotheism. Henotheism. New Testament too. There are many gods, there are many lords, but we only worship one God, the Father, and one Lord, Jesus Christ. Right? That's different than Christianity, which is Trinitarian monotheist. That's different than Judaism, post-500 Common Era, which is strictly and severely monotheist. And that's different than Islam, which is severely monotheist. Y'all understand what I'm saying? Henotheism is the biblical, what you get in the Bible. You shall have no other gods before me. Can I have gods after you? Okay, no, not even after. Okay, but there are other gods, right? Henotheism. Get used to that word. So, this difference of viewpoint between the Samaritans' own understanding of themselves and the Judean understanding of the Samaritans colors the rest of the biblical record, because it comes from the end of the phone conversation. That's the Judean end. You don't get the Samaritans' end on that conversation. Even though Samaritans are mentioned very few times in the Bible usually gives that negative view of their history. It's checkered past. Checkered past. Moving to the Second Temple period, 520 BCE, according to the biblical record of Ezra chapter 4, the Samaritans at first rejoiced to learn that those proto-Judeans returning from Babylonian exile were charged with rebuilding the temple. But when their offer of assistance was rejected by the returnees, get the hell out of here, scram, you all are half-breeds, the Samaritans opposed and sabotaged that project. Ezra chapter 4, verses 4 to 5. Thereupon the local inhabitants discouraged the people of Judah and frightened them off from building. They also bribed counselors to work against them and to frustrate their plans during all the years of Cyrus, king of Persia, and even into the reign of Darius, king of Persia. Verse 25. As a result, work on the house of God in Jerusalem ceased. What I'm trying to show you here is the centuries-long hatred and animosity and antipathy between what the people who became the Samaritans and the people who became the Judeans. 700 years of it. The Samaritans, according to the author of Ezra and Nehemiah, also opposed and sabotaged the rebuilding of the temple walls. Of the walls of Jerusalem, I'm sorry. Persia was satisfied that this mutual, conquerors like to divide and conquer. That's an old strategy, used to recent times. When the British colonized and the European powers colonized the African peoples, they took rivalries that were simple rivalries and exaggerated them. For instance, think about Rwanda and Burundi and Tanzania, that area where you have Hutu and Bahutu and Batutsi and Batwa. Those peoples, they had problems, but their problems were multiplied 1,000-fold by the Belgianese, the Belgian conquerors and the people that were there. Divide and conquer. Same thing in Nigeria with the British. So this is how it was in the Levant under Persian domination. Persia was satisfied that you don't have a fully united Israelite people. You have the Samaritans and the Judeans both claiming to be authentic and hostile to one another with their traditions. That's good. Because divided, they stay conquered. They won't revolt. Too weak. The point to notice here is that the customary tendency of this Middle Eastern culture toward factionalism had continued for 200 years since the Assyrian invasion and would continue all the way into New Testament times. Whether or not Samaritans ever built their own temple on Mount Gerizim is a point of scholarly debate to this day. Archaeological remains of such temples have eluded excavators. If you're going to build a freaking temple, you think we'd be able to find it, right? So whatever temple they had, if they had a temple there, it certainly wasn't like the Jerusalem temple. It was modest. And that understanding, they must have had a very simple shrine. Something simple, something small. The Greek period, following Alexander the Great's conquest, 300 BCE and following. The Samaritans rallied behind Alexander the Great. You think that made the Judeans like them more? Members of the house of Israel remained loyal to Persia. When Alexander destroyed Samaria, the Samaritans obviously became wary of the Macedonians. But at this time, differences of opinion about Jerusalem and Mount Gerizim as centers of worship continued to be a major element that kept members of the house of Israel and Samaritans apart. Be that as it may, anti-Samaritan sentiment reached a peak in 128 BCE when John Hyrcanus, governor and high priest in Judea, destroyed the Samaritan sanctuary at Gerizim. Do you think that made the Samaritans love the Judeans? Yeah, not really. Now the Roman period, we're getting into the time of Jesus now. Josephus, the historian, reports two events about the Samaritans that help a modern reader understand the anti-Samaritan sentiment evident in Matthew and elsewhere in the other Gospels. Sometime about 6 to 9 Common Era, a group of Samaritans secretly joined some Judean pilgrims on their way to Jerusalem at Passover. They scattered human bones in the porticos and sanctuary of the temple, thereby defiling it very seriously. Passover ended that year quick. Anyone who touched a corpse or human bone would be unclean for a day and would be obliged to purify themselves in a mikveh, a ritual bath, making them unfit for the Passover festival. In response, the priests excluded everyone from the temple. No doubts, the gossip network spread this news throughout the entire land. Imagine, if the teenage Jesus was not himself among the Passover pilgrims, he surely would have heard this story back in Nazareth. It's not difficult to imagine the reaction of any devout Yahwist to this insulting sacrilege. Imagine the effect this would have had on an impressionable Israelite teenager. It would never have been forgotten as long as Jesus, the pre-Paschal Jesus, lived prior to the resurrection. The second event took place around 20 years after Jesus died, 51 Common Era. Indeed, it was a major cause for the first Judean revolt against Rome. Josephus offers two versions of the story. The basic report is this: Samaritans living in Gemma, on the border between Galilee and Samaria, murdered one, or murdered many, Judean pilgrims on their way to Jerusalem for the festival of Passover. How nice. In retaliation, Judeans from Jerusalem came and massacred the inhabitants of Gemma. They killed everybody. So when you think about the parable of the Good Samaritan, the only Good Samaritan is a dead Samaritan. Right? Okay. The chain of events after this becomes rather complicated. Simply told, the Samaritans managed to keep the sympathies of the local Roman representatives on their side. These Romans imprisoned and murdered Judeans. The Judeans remained persistent and eventually had the entire affair moved to Rome, where Caesar ruled favorably in behalf of the Judeans and ordered that the Samaritans be punished. Complex as the issue is, it nevertheless demonstrates that the 700 years of hostility between Samaritans and the house of Israel since 721 BCE has showed no signs of abating. Folks, the sophisticated quality of the literary composition of the story of Jesus and the Samaritan woman, John chapter 4, verses 5 to 42, along with the recognition that centuries-long hostility between Samaritans and Judeans would not be so easily and readily set aside, caused scripture interpreters, exegetes, to read the story of John chapter 4 somewhat skeptically. Notre Dame biblical scholar Father John Meyer warns that all of this makes one wary of claiming that behind this magnificent theological composition, foreshadowing as it does Jesus' followers' mission to the Samaritans decades later, lies a particular event from the life of the pre-Paschal Jesus. In other words, the story of John chapter 4, verses 1 through 42 is a magnificent theological fiction. It never happened to the pre-Paschal Jesus. Hey, thanks for watching. Just continue the playlist for the next part of the study. If you have further questions, this is good. They will get addressed, so keep watching. If you found value, please subscribe, like, and share. As always, questions, comments, and criticisms are most welcome. God bless you.